Hello. Today we have a Patreon, one of our Patreons coming to us from Harker Heights, Texas, which is in central Texas, like between Dallas and Austin, if anyone's wondering. Mike Berman, thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you.
Well,
Hi,
thank you,
Mike.
Sarah. And Louise, very nice to be here. Nice to meet you, so to speak, in person, as it were.
Nice to meet you too. I know. Thank you for becoming a Patreon too. So that's very helpful to us.
Yeah.
And I love your location, your background. For anyone who's watching on YouTube, just like it's a book, a room of bookshelves, which is after my own heart.
Me
Love
too.
that.
A wonderful office.
When I look at a house, I look at wall space. Strictly.
Yeah, I have a very hard time parting with books. I just can't.
Yes.
Can't do it.
Ebooks have made it possible for me to be stationary now. I don't have to move anymore.
Don't have to cart them around. Well, tell us your story.
Yeah, anxious to hear. Tell us.
Okay.
Tell us.
I was born in 1945 on August 8th in Nashville, Tennessee, in the General Hospital there, Nashville General Hospital. My mom was a 18-year-old woman from Bay City, Michigan. And the day after my birth, she surrendered me for adoption. I remained in the hospital for 10 days for reasons I can't determine. I don't know if that was normal at the time. It seems excessive, even for then. But there's nothing in my record that indicates any problems or premature birth. I don't know if I was a full-term baby. I don't know my birth weight. That's not on my birth certificate either. So I don't know. But after 10 days, I was taken by train from Nashville to Memphis to the Tennessee Children's Home Society, which was notoriously run by Georgia Tann, who you all touched upon in your last episode. And I don't know how long I was there, but I do know that I was in New York City in the care of my adoptive parents on the 19th of September. I have a document. It's a certificate of circumcision because my parents were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And males are usually circumcised on the 8th day of their birth, after birth. Of course, in my case, it would have been postponed. I'm assuming my dad would have done it as soon as he had wind that I was on my way. So probably within 3 days of that is when I was delivered to them. And when I say delivered, I was literally delivered. I was picked up in a train station, Grand Central Station in Manhattan, New York City. Much of what I'm going to tell you, I know from my record, which is interesting that I was able to get it. But some of what I'm telling you was from my ex-wife. She was very close with my mom, and they talked a lot about it. And she never mentioned any of this to me until
when you say mom, do you mean your adoptive mom?
My adoptive mom.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And who didn't mention it to you? Your mom or your ex-wife?
Yeah. We all live in the same town. You know,
yeah.
And we get together regularly, and you know, it's a good situation.
Yeah.
And when I finally had started searching in 2017, after I had gotten much of the information I needed, I approached my family. I think we were together for a birthday, and I used that opportunity to break the news that I had been searching. And
so it took you until you were.
I was on just
considerably, through middle age and
72nd birthday.
Wow.
It was a combination of things, largely seeing all these DNA ads. You know, they were on Facebook and wherever, on the internet, just in general, they kept cropping up. And I have a background in biology. I studied biology in college and in graduate school. So the DNA thing was really intriguing to me. And then I thought of it as only the ethnicity. But, when you know nothing, that's intriguing in and of itself. But it was expensive, and I felt a little queasy about doing it still, even though both my adoptive parents were long gone at that point. But nevertheless, I kept looking, and I know I was inching towards that anyway. And then one evening, I was on a telephone call with a first cousin of mine, an adoptive first cousin. She's older than me. And both our parents, my adoptive mother and her father, came to North America together. They were born in what is today Belarus. And my mother was born in 1915. And in 1922, right around there, her two first cousins and their mother, that mother being a sister of her father, and this is a little confusing. She lost her mother, my mom did, about a year or two after she was born. And her father wanted his sister to take my mother with them when they went to North America. And this was right after this First World War in Central Europe. There was a lot of confusion. The Russian Revolution had taken place. The Soviet troops, well, the Red Army troops were in that area, and those two first cousins would have been prime recruitment material in their late teens. And their father had gone on to Saskatchewan a few years earlier, which was a common strategy, I guess. The father would leave, get work, find housing, send money back, and then the wife and children would follow. So they were about to do that. And my mother's father beseeched them to take my mother with them, which they did.
So this is, again, your adoptive mother. This is not your history. Okay.
I generally speak of my birth mother by her name, Carrie.
Okay.
Just, it's easier. And my birth father's name was Floyd. So that's how it's just,
Okay.
simple.
I was just confused about like getting all the history when it was they're not your history. Like,
If I say mom, I'm talking, or dad, it's my parents.
Okay.
Parents. So
Everyone's
anyway, they
different.
came to Saskatchewan, and a few years later, that father had died, and the boys were now young men, and they had married. And one settled in Montreal, and the other married an American woman, and they immigrated into the United States. He, his mother, my mother's aunt, and my mother. But when they came into the United States through immigration, they claimed my mother as their sister and child. So I always knew these cousins as my mother's brothers, because that's how they refer to each other. Once they crossed over, my mother was essentially informally adopted. So that's how I grew up knowing them. And
so did you grew up so they adopted you you got circumcised and born in New York, go to New York City on a train and grew up in New York City?
Grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn. Well, first in Queens, and then we moved to Brooklyn when I was about 10 and stayed there until I went off to college.
And did you have any siblings?
In 1950, my mother gave birth to, this is after 13 years of marriage, she gave birth to her first and only child, my brother. So he's 4.5 years younger.
And had they been trying, was the adoption a result of infertility?
They had been married 9 years when they first contacted Georgia Tann.
So they assumed probably we're not having a baby.
Right. And both my father had two siblings, and they were married by this time. He was the youngest of the three, and they all had children. And, that's what you did. You got married and you tried to have children. I don't know if she had any miscarriages. I don't know where the fault lay, but eventually she did get pregnant. And that was my brother. And he had tried, my dad had kept in touch with Georgia Tann. One of the amazing things that I found in my record when it came was this packet of letters exchanged between my dad and Georgia Tann. He was
Georgia Tann herself?
Well, it was
someone at the agency.
Signed off, and I don't know if she or a secretary did that, but each one was signed with her signature, I assume. And he was trying to keep the lines of communication open because they wanted another child. They were hoping to get a little girl. So periodically he would write and send a check, $15 or something to the home just to, Now how they ever, this was
line Georgia Tann's pockets.
How they ever found this place. Why a Jewish couple in New York City in 1945, right?
That's what I was thinking.
Post World War II, that's now the single biggest Jewish population in the world after the Second World War. And
it's amazing they didn't go to the Louise Wise agency.
Exactly. Now I'm thinking that first of all, demand and supply might have been working against them. And they were a little older. My mother would have been about 29 at that point. My father was 6 years older than her. So that might have been working against them. I don't know. It could have been the money, the financial side of it. But somehow they got connected with this adoption agency in Tennessee. I just don't, I can't, I can't cross that T. I don't know how it happened. I have a
Now-
suspicion though. My dad had a brother-in-law who was in the same, he owned a boys and men's clothing store, and that's the line my dad was in. And at that time, he was working for his brother-in-law. Now, his brother-in-law was very well connected. He was a wealthy man, and he raced horses. And it's conceivable that he had reason to travel in the South, Kentucky,
Yeah.
horse country. And he was politically connected. And there was a governor of New York State, Layman, and he adopted a child through Georgia Tann too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and every time my dad would send a check to Georgia Tann, there'd be an accompanying check from his brother-in-law. So I think that was the connection, that he got him, connected with Georgia Tann.
He
You
heard
never had an
about it.
opportunity to ask any of these questions,
I
really.
never
Did
did.
you, growing up, did you talk about your adoption, or was it just?
I always knew I was adopted.
Mhm.
I've heard that before. And I had no idea how that came about.
You never, your parents weren't, you didn't have, I mean, of course, it was a different era, right? Like
Yes.
people didn't
Well,
talk.
I could speak to them, I discovered, because I did ask one question of my parents, of my father, and one question of my mother. And that was it. And both times they answered very quickly. They didn't seem to be in any way disturbed by it. But I never really went into depth. I was a happy kid. I had a good adoption. My parents were loving people. Excuse me. It's very dry here in Texas.
Mhm.
And hot.
and dry.
So
Hot.
is the air, could you hear the air conditioner? 'Cause it's
No.
like-
No.
So I'll tell you what happened. Two things that made me think about adoption. One was in 1953 or so, 54, Walt Disney had a TV show. And they presented a 3-part series based on the life of Davy Crockett. And every chapter, every series episode started with a song. And it went, born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free, killed him a bar when he was only 3, a bear. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. And being a young 8-year-old or whatever, I used to fantasize that I could maybe be related to old Davy Crockett. He could be my great grandpa, maybe, And every kid in that era, every kid my age had a coonskin cap and a little flintlock pistol. And
Yeah.
it was the first merchandised TV show, I think. And anyway, that passed into oblivion. But that was the first time I really kind of caught myself thinking about it. And then when we moved to Brooklyn, one day I was outside. I was waiting for a friend who lived next door, and we had plans to go bike riding. And he came out and he ran over to me and he said, "Michael, did you know that you were adopted?" And I was kind of taken aback, and I said, "Well, yes, I know. Why are you asking me? How do you know?" Apparently, he overheard his mother talking with my mother. They were friends. They belonged to the same charitable organization. And he was a very bright kid. He was a single, an only child. He used to call his parents by their first name, which I thought was amazingly sophisticated and cool. But
He's ahead of his time.
He was ahead of his time. He's the guy. He introduced me to reading. Really, he took me. When we moved there, first thing he did is showed me where the library was.
Are you still in touch?
No, they moved away when I was still a kid, and I never heard from them again. But later that day, after we came back, and my mom was fixing dinner, and I was thinking about it. And I said, "Well, I do know, don't I? But how do I know? I have no recollection of that." And I just put it away, and packaged it, and went on my normal development. And when I was in high school, I sometimes worked in my dad's store. He owned his own business at that time. It was a boys and men's shop. And I'd go in and clean up and sweep and fix stock. And it was a quiet day. There were no customers. And my dad was at the front desk doing a crossword puzzle. So I walked up to the desk and I leaned over the counter and I said, "Dad, can I ask you a question?" I'm telling you, this took every ounce of courage that I could muster.
I'm sure.
And he just looked up from me and said, "Sure, Mickey, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Dad, was I adopted?" And he looked kind of puzzled. And he said, "Yes, Mike, Mickey, you always knew that." And I said, "Dad, I did, but I have no recollection of how I know." And he said, "Well, Mom used to tell you, we told you when you were young, probably a toddler, but Mom read that story to you a number of times." I said, so okay, a story. He said, "Well, it was a book that was commonly used, and we tailored it to meet the circumstances, and you liked the story. And so you would ask Mom to read it occasionally, and she would. And we always assumed that sooner or later you would ask questions. And we were perfectly ready to tell you what we knew, which is not very much, frankly." And anyway, I said at that point, I just, okay, that was enough, and that was cool.
It was like overload for you at that
Yeah,
age. Like that's it.
Yeah, information overload. And then a couple of years, I was still in high school, so it may have been that year or a little later. I was in the kitchen doing my homework, and my mom was, getting dinner ready, and she was a few feet away from me. And I said, "Mom, when did you and Dad go to Tennessee?" And she didn't even look up. She was just continued. And she said, "We never had to go to Tennessee. We never went." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I just went back to my, algebra and whatever I was doing. And I just never knew what to do with that. But
It's like they were open, but not giving of information. So you're like,
I think they would have. I had no inkling that they were even remotely embarrassed or shocked or worried about it. They answered matter-of-factly, and I'm absolutely certain I could have just gone on with it. But I love my parents, and I wasn't, I didn't want to go there. If I could have had a magic wand and said, "I'm now your biological child," that's what I would have done. I would have just erased that whole thing. And
Did you feel like different? Did you have different characteristics or stuff than your family, than your mother, your father, and your brother? And okay. So you would, so maybe that was kind of you were shielding yourself. Like, I don't want to accept this or know this or.
Well, it's only now that I put pieces together.
Yeah.
Because I have the vocabulary now to understand it.
Yeah.
That's one of the big things that really struck me reading The Primal Wound, is that concept of pre-verbal memory. Because we experience things, but without words, we can't recall it. We process thought with words. Without words, we're intellectually mute to ourselves. But the damage is there, the fright. I mean, a baby, human, severed from its mother is got to be it's an existential crisis, the worst kind. And if you're in a place where you really are being handled and gently, and people are talking to you, and you're getting regular feedings, and that might be mitigated to an extent. If you're going literally from one mother to the next, that might mitigate it to some extent. But still, it's there.
It is.
And but you need the language to think about it. And I never, I just put it out of my mind because I was happy. I had a good childhood. My parents loved me. They were very affectionate, and they were demonstrative too. I was telling my kids once recently, we had some guests coming over. We were at my ex-wife's for Thanksgiving, and one of my son's friends came in, and they all walked over, shook his hand, patted his shoulder. And it occurred to me that in the entirety of my life with my parents, I never shook my father's hand. If I tried to do that, he would just bat it out of the way and get me in a bear hug. So,
were you close to your brother?
Yes, but we were 4.5 years apart.
Yeah.
So our lives were always out of sync.
Yeah.
And he's different than I am in many ways. But yeah, we love each other. We get along. He lives in Connecticut. I don't see him that much. But when I was, when I was 10, he was 5. What a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old don't have.
Yeah.
Much. And then when he was 10, I was 15. I was in high school.
I have the same thing with my brother. You get older and you become friends again. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. For the first time in many ways.
Yeah.
And then when he was 15, I was in college. And when he was in college, I was back in New York going to graduate school. So our lives were constantly out of sync. And when he graduated, we went to school in Connecticut. He stayed up there, and that's where he still lives.
Mike, I have a question for you.
Sure.
When you were like in relationships and stuff, after high school, you went off to college. I know you've been married and married again, right? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And we're separated now.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Does that answer your question about relationships?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Like, because I have a little bit of the same thing where I push things down, but then they come up in relationships and things like that. I was wondering, did things kind of start clicking when you're reading things like, oh
Yes,
my goodness.
yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, sometimes it's hard to know. I mean, people are not adopted have problems too.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
very often there are similar problems. A lot of people have trouble with relationships for, maybe the way they were raised. Adoption has its unique entry point, but it's not, the only way you can traumatize kids. But there's some things that I know absolutely were a product of adoption, because I used to have this, it was like this anger that would, just always beneath the surface. And sometimes it would bubble up, and somebody would say something that was offensive or was, mildly irritating, the kind of thing you might get angry or a little perturbed about, but I'd blow it out of proportion. And then later I'd be completely embarrassed by it. I said, why did I do that? And this would happen over and over again. And if I were alone and I dropped something, I'm very clumsy, and I drop at least one glass of whatever every year at least, and it shatters. I only use plastic now for that reason. But if I did something stupid like that, I would just, even if I were alone, I'd kick and curse, and it would just be ridiculous. And now when it happens, I just laugh, and I go get a mop and a broom and I clean it. I clean it up. But it was always there, and I know that very often I would flare up over things that just didn't warrant that kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I consulted with a psychologist after I had started this. I remember asking my wife, we were again at my ex-wife's house, which is where we usually meet. And my ex was fixing some stuff to eat, and we were sitting at the counter, my wife and I told her about this book, and I said, does that make sense to you? Now, they're both women who gave birth. And I explained it, and my wife immediately said, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That is, there's definitely something to that, and you need to look into that. And I found excuse me, please. I found a psychologist who was willing to speak with me on the phone initially, just to feel me out. And I explained, my age. And I said, look, I'm not going to go into long-term therapy. I just need some to ask some questions, maybe have somebody ask me a few probing questions, kind of see what they think. Somebody who knows about adoption, treats adoptees, and maybe can recommend reading. And of course, the first book she recommended, I already had by that point. I found that from Facebook groups. But I had a couple of conversations, and she told me that we talked about anger, and she said, well, of course you were. Of course you have this unresolvable anger. And I said, how? Well, you were abandoned. What do you think a young child or a young animal, how they react? Fear elicits anger. Anger allows you to fight back. They're intertwined. And because you can't recall that doesn't mean it's not there. And this has been going on since you were a child. And it was like, it just washed out of me. And
but you mean that your anger left?
Anger. It was
Just the knowledge.
gone. And the way I knew it was when I, again, knocked over something. I don't remember what it was. And I just got, down on my knees and cleaned it up, picked up all the shards, mopped up the mess, and just went on to whatever I was doing. And then I stopped and I thought, wait a minute, how am I doing this? And it's been like that ever since.
It's the knowledge of what's
exactly
happened
right.
with
And
us.
then my mind just reworked it, and now it's gone.
So if you had, this is maybe more than you want to share. So you had your ex-wife and your current soon to be ex-wife are friends. So,
Yeah.
well, you're all
I mean,
friendly because I have
yeah,
that in my life
yeah,
too.
yeah,
So have
totally.
you discussed with them like how you were in relationships? Were you guarded or,
No, not
this kind
really.
of thing?
Um, I don't, at this point, I don't know that. I think my ex-wife would be a little harder to deal with that because I think she's a little more, um, not anti, but when we grew up, psychology was not something that was
Oh, yeah.
common. People didn't just go to psychologists to deal with like family issues and things like that. It was something you dealt with on your own, or you didn't. And then
Yeah.
again, divorce was not easy. So people tended to stick with it. And, maybe they didn't benefit, but maybe the kids did. I mean, my ex-wife and I, we were never in fisticuffs, or anything like
Right. Right.
that. We changed and we had problems and we didn't work it out. And maybe we could have. I don't know. It's hard to go
So
in time.
Yeah, it
you
is.
you went to college, you went to grad school. When did you get married? And then this kind of two-part question. Then did having, because many adoptees who are parents talk about that connection, the first biological connection. Did you have any kind of light bulb moment with the birth of your children or?
Oh, yeah. 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 As a matter of fact, my first wife, she's from Holland. And when I met her, she was working upstate New York in resort hotels. She would come here for 6 months. And up there, they would hire you without a work permit, that kind of thing. And she got a lot of tips. So she went home with a lot of money. And this was in the early 60s. So Holland was still feeling the effects of the Second World War. There were, things were tight. And she could buy things for her parents, carpeting, things like that most people wouldn't have. So she kept doing that. And I ended up this one particular summer as her busboy. So she was a waitress in the dining room and I was her busboy. And I had been very, very shy with girls. I had not really had any successful relationships. And for some reason, maybe her greater maturity, I don't know. But we hit it off. And she wasn't Jewish. And that was going to be a problem with my parents. It didn't matter to me. But fortunately, she herself had a very, very close relationship with a Jewish family in Holland, a family that had survived Auschwitz. And she was very, very close to the mother of that family, this older woman. And she worked for them they owned some shoe stores, a very high line or high brow shoe stores. And so she worked for them. And she always felt an affinity for them and had a great respect for Judaism and the Jewish people. So for her, conversion was something she was going to do anyway. But there was a rocky road there with my parents. But once they got to know her, they embraced her. And we got married after my first year of graduate school. And then during my second year, I got drafted. And the Army let me finish my first year. But then in 69, in July of 69, I had to go in the Army. So I was gone for 2 years. We lived in a place that was we didn't live with my parents, but we lived in the same structure. We had separate like living areas.
In Brooklyn?
In Brooklyn, yeah. This was all in Brooklyn. I moved to Brooklyn when I turned 10 that summer, just in time for the Brooklyn Dodgers to win the series. And then they deserted us. Anyway, we don't want to go there. That was really traumatic. You talk about trauma in your life. That was a primal wound of magnitude. So anyway, it was.
But you just get abandoned first by your mother,
right.
then
That's
the Brooklyn Dodgers.
That's right. That's another wound. I haven't even begun to address that yet. So I think it was at times like that she and my parents really bonded. They were very, very close. And my mother did talk to her a lot And it wasn't until I, at that dinner table, when I was showing my family, I had this whole book of my adoption record, and I brought it with me, and we were going through that. And my wife says to me that, Mommy told me about how when they got you, that you were very, very dirty. And that the first thing they did was they took you to an emergency room.
Oh,
And I said,
she knew all these things that you didn't know. That's
said,
interesting.
excuse me, how do you know this? She said, well, Mommy told me. So
Oh, that's
Mom told
sad.
you, and you never brought this up. And she kind of went, I just didn't think you wanted to know. And she said that I was dehydrated
Oh.
and I had to be dewormed.
Oh my God.
Dewormed.
So before they even took me to their apartment, they took me to Elmhurst General Hospital. And the doctor said, yeah, this kid is in bad shape. And,
Just think of what's going on down there.
well, that year in
That's
1945,
disgusting.
there was a 3-month period where 50 kids, upwards of 50 kids died of some kind of intestinal disease
Uh-huh.
In
in
the
the Tennessee Children's Home Society.
wow.
Gross.
Yeah, it was the Memphis branch that was the notorious one.
And you probably would have too if you didn't get on that train.
Who knows?
The worms and
Who knows? Yeah, who knows?
God.
But that aside, it's always trauma. And there's no question about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be, there would be people who'd say how triggered they were by passing a pet adoption center or the shelf, adoption, Elf on the Shelf adoption center around Christmas time and things like that. And I said, look,
Yeah. Anyway,
but when you said that, it was just like, adoption is not a good thing. Nobody will ever say it's at best a second-rate solution, at best. And many times it's not even that.
Yeah.
One person I heard say recently, you can never heal the primal wound, but a good
No.
adoption can be a dressing.
Good
And
way of putting it.
yeah, and I thought so. My parents did not cause my mother, Carrie, to give me up. She did that for whatever reasons, understandable or not. And I learned from my adoption record that 17 months before she gave me up, she had another child. So she would have been just on the cusp of 16 at that time, and put that child up for adoption. Only that child was adopted in Michigan.
So you have a half sibling.
I have several, because 2 years after I was born, Carrie married. She got married, and she had a daughter in 47. She had another daughter in 48, and then a third daughter in 57.
Oh,
Now,
Now, are there any of these siblings? Do you know any of them?
yeah.
Okay, I'm curious, because you went your entire life until 2017, you decide you're taking the DNA test. Up to prior to that point, you were, let's say, less than curious about your history.
I was. I just, and my parents' history too, like so many American kids, I wanted to be part of the melting pot. I didn't want to be a hyphenated American.
Right.
My father was born in New Haven. My mother, as I said, was born in what is today Belarus. But my father's parents came from Russia in 1904 and settled in New Haven, Connecticut, where my dad was born and his siblings. I never asked about that. I never wanted to know. I wasn't a Russian American. If I'd ever said that in front of my father, he probably would have been, slightly miffed. But yet, now you see all these kids, maybe fourth generation, third generation in the United States, and genealogy is a booming industry.
Yeah.
People want to know where they come from. Identity suddenly is important. Now, you asked me before about appearance, and I was incandescently white when I was a kid. I had platinum hair. In most of the photographs, black and white photographs, of course, you can't even see my eyebrows. They don't even show up. And the first time I really was aware of it, though, was when my brother was bar mitzvah. We took a group photo. And when the photo was developed and I saw the four of us together, I was amazed at how my brother was starting to morph into my father. And later in life, they were like identical twins. My father was, his hair was white from as far back as I can remember. I don't know how old he was when his hair started to turn gray, but I only knew him as somebody who had white hair. He kept his hair, more than me, unfortunately. And my brother had that same thing. I mean, he was just white when I still had, light brown hair. But he kept it all. He has a really thick, full head of hair. But I think that was the first time I was really aware of it, and from that point on, I did think more about it. I would look in the mirror and I try to say, who can I, how could I morph into these people?
And then when you had your
just
children, because
Well,
you were
my
starting to
first
answer
son,
that question,
Yeah, he was born by C-section, so I wasn't there to see it. But
but your connection to him,
when I
that's
first
when
looked
you,
at him, the hair, and I have blue eyes. I was a typical tan baby, blonde hair, blue eyes. His eyes were brown like his mother's, but his hair was white. Well, you can't see the picture, but I mean, he was a stunning child. That combination was just striking. But I could see features in him, even as a baby. And as he got older, more and more of that developed. And his personality was more like me, unfortunately for him. He's a black.
did you feel like a sense of grounding?
Mm-hmm.
It helped. It helped. And then I had my next son was born 3 years later, and it was also C-section. Yeah. And my daughter, although she looks much more like her mother physically, is much more like me in the personality. And we get along very, very well. And she has embraced this whole thing.
Yeah,
I
okay,
was
so
gonna
tell
ask
us.
that. Mm-hmm.
So 2017,
All right, so I decided to do this.
yes.
And the first thing I did was I went online and went to the Tennessee site, state of Tennessee. And I started to see what was available in terms of records, because I had no idea. And I read down this paragraph, this long number of paragraphs for how you get adoption records, who can get what. And I was so nervous doing this. I mean, I really was. I wasn't even paying attention. So I got all the way to the bottom of the page. I said, I have no idea what I just read. And I was about to scroll back up, and I saw that there was like a heading. It was more print below. So I scrolled down, and it said, for people born prior to 1951. So I said, oh, that's interesting. So I scrolled down a little further, and it made it very, very clear that if you were born prior to 1951 and adopted in Tennessee, you could and would get your records. All you had to do is prove who you were, identity. So there was a little form to fill out. I did that, and within half an hour, I got an email. It went into greater detail of what would serve as identifying papers and so forth. The next
It was that fast. That's
that
interesting.
fast.
Wow.
That fast. These people in the post-adoption unit, that's what they call it in Tennessee, were the most amazing public servants I have ever dealt with.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Everything I asked them, I got an answer like instantly. If I texted them something or I emailed them at 9 o'clock at night, first thing when they open in the morning, I get a response. It was always like that. They were
That's
really
nice.
So anyway, I went out. That as soon as I got through with that, it was still morning, late morning. I went out. I had the papers. I scanned them on my scanner. So I took my birth certificate, my Tennessee birth certificate, my phony birth certificate, my driver's license, my military ID, and I went to the bank, got a notary to sign all these things, stamp it and everything, put it in an envelope, put in the fee, and it was out. And 2 weeks later, I got an email saying that I'd been approved. So now they said, we have to go gather your records. This can take from 3 to 5 months. And this is the fee that was required. So I sent that check in. It was, it was a little more expensive, but it wasn't, a showbreaker. And I thought, okay, so 3 to 5 months. Now I'm going to start doing this DNA testing earnestly. So I ordered the test. I tested on all 4 sites. Naively, not knowing that you could download from some and go to others. And then when the results started coming in, and now I was faced with, I knew nothing. I hadn't the slightest clue. I still believed that whoever she was, my mother was, and my father probably were in Tennessee, right? Lived there, were born there. So I didn't know anything. But little by little, I understand DNA quite well. So I knew how it works. And I was able to learn the nuts and bolts of it, just like y'all probably did. You tested,
Mhm.
right? Did you
Mhm.
both test?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So little by little, I started to realize that one camp was strictly Eastern European, which was interesting and ironic. And the other
Yeah.
camp was more Northeastern European and British Isles. No surprise, blonde hair, blue eyes, where else did I come from? But both camps, ground zero for these families was Bay City, Michigan.
Huh.
Tennessee never showed up in anything. So that remained a puzzle until I got my record, actually. But about a month in, I was starting to feel my way around. And I had this match. It was like 500 something centimorgan. So it was the highest match I had up until then. So I wrote to his name was Josh. And I wrote to Josh and he wrote back to me immediately. He was still online. And he was a 20-year-old kid in Michigan. And his girlfriend had bought him a test for his birthday. So he didn't really have any interest in, he had no knowledge of genealogy and no ambitions to do any genealogy.
It's the key.
But he said his mother wants to do this. And he has an aunt who had started a family tree on Ancestry. But as far as he knew, she never took a test. But he said, let me get in touch with my mom and she will put you in touch with my aunt, which she did. And this person, her name is Beth, she agreed to help me because it was a maybe 300 person tree, but she had, the nuts and bolts of it and the beginnings of it. And because of my match with this kid, Josh, I knew we were pretty closely related because Josh is her nephew. So we start working together and she was devoting, this was in the summer, so she was off and she had a lot of time to devote. So we worked together and we'd work morning to night. I was retired, so I had the time. And little by little, we were starting to put things together and it looked more and more like this was my maternal line. So it comes up, it was the 29th of September, I'll never forget it. And we had been working all day and it was like 10:30 at night. We were both bleary-eyed. And all of a sudden, she says to me, do you see what I see? And I look at the screen where we had just been working and it dawned on me that one of these three sisters has got to be my mother. And one of those three sisters is Beth's mother. Mm-hmm. So I'm working with either, a first cousin or a half sister.
Half sister.
And so of the three girls, one was married already when I would have been conceived. So that would be in mid-November of 44. The other two would have been teenagers. Carrie would have been 17, just about to turn 18. And Mary, the other one, would have been 15, 16, something like that. And Elizabeth was married, as I said. And so it seemed unlikely that she would, she was just married, I think, in 1941. So this would have been only 3 years later. Not impossible, but we just narrowed it down to Carrie and Mary. And I said, well, there's nothing we can do to settle that right now because all the matches are going to be the same regardless. And I should be getting my record because earlier that week, so this was on a Friday night, I got an email that they had gotten my records together and, far earlier than they had anticipated or that they told me. And they gave me an option of either coming to Nashville to look at the records and I could have whatever I wanted, or in lieu of that, they could just copy everything and mail it to me. So and that's what I told them to do that. I sent them a check for copying fee was 12 cents a page maybe, and the post. So I figured it would be coming the following week, In the event, I got up the next morning, Saturday morning, and right to my right here is a window that opens up and looks out at the street and my mailbox. So I'm doing, stuff, checking my matches like I do every morning of my life now. And I saw the mail truck come. I ran down to the mailbox, not anticipating that there would be anything in there, but there was this big fat manila envelope. And I pulled it out and I looked at the the return address, and it said post adoption unit, Nashville, Tennessee. And I can't tell you the reaction I had. My hands were shaking. I was starting to hyperventilate. So I went up to the house, and I have an island in my kitchen, and I put the package there, and I just leaned against the other counter, and I just looked at it. And I started to walk around the counter. I poured some ice water for myself. And little by little, I settled down. So I opened this envelope and I pulled it out. And it was just, 50 pages. If
Wow.
more. And I started to kind of, divide it up. And I sent you that sheet, right? That it was the social workers' notes. That alone was, a trove of information.
In depth. Yeah.
In depth. Turns out that Elizabeth, I was born in Tennessee because Carrie went to visit her sister in Tennessee. Her sister was married to a man who was in the military, 1944. Big surprise. He was stationed at an air base just south of Nashville called Smyrna. And I think that air base was in operation until 1970s. And so she was living there, and Carrie, in her 7th month, decided this one's going to be born away from home. And she went to stay with her sister, went into labor, took a cab to the hospital, and gave birth to me 20 minutes after admission. And then the next morning signed the adoption, the surrender agreement. Which
When you got all these records,
everything.
was Carrie, no, but when you got them, was Carrie still alive?
No, she died in 91.
Okay, and
This was
and
in
your
20
father, your biological
he died in 1960, before his 60th birthday. He was born in 1909, which ironically was the year that my adoptive father was born. So there's another, and this whole thing about Michigan, because that's where my mother grew up. She was born overseas, but she grew up in Michigan. We used to go to Michigan to visit her family there. So anyway, all of these things are just there, and I'm stunned. And of course, now I know that Beth is in fact my sister. I know now that I had another brother, another adoptee before me. I was looking forward to being like the patriarch of the family, and now I was demoted to 2nd place. And we had a hell of a time finding him, because in one place in my record, it noted that it was a female. Which obviously wasn't. And I think that was either somebody misunderstood, or Carrie was just intentionally just misdirecting people, because several things that were in that record were just false. She said he said the father was 23 years old. In fact, my birth father at the time of conception was 35 years old.
Oh, Floyd.
Well, we do know that that adoption agencies in that era typically did falsify a lot of information. So I'm not sure Carrie can take all the heat for that.
I don't know. You're right. You're absolutely right. I don't know. There's no way. But other things did come up, accurate. But that was obviously false. And this is funny, because it was another clue that really was important later as I started getting more and more into my research. Wherever it asked for the name of the father, it was blank, except in a few places. One of those was on the surrender agreement, a couple of other places. And in lieu of a name, instead of a blank space, there was the name Floyd Doe, like John Doe. And I thought, well, that's weird. I knew about John Doe. Everybody knows that, John Doe, Jane Doe. I thought, well, maybe in Tennessee, that's what they did. Maybe it was Floyd Doe in the South. Who knew? But that name stuck with me. And later on, when I came down to it, that was the name of my birth father. His actual name was Florian, which is a Polish name, because he was born in the United States, but and his parents were too. But the next generation were immigrants from Poland, and they were still using Polish names very often in that era. But he went by Floyd Edward, and his last name I can't pronounce. It's Kasprzyk. So 8 letters, 1 vowel.
So you were never really able to find out their story and how they got together. And have you since now connected with all of your siblings? And where do you stand now in this moment?
Well, Beth and it turned out I called Beth as soon as I could catch my breath, and I made copies of that of several documents that I sent it to her. And of course, I told her when I called her, I said, you got to sit down, because she didn't know anything. And we had one sister still alive. They were both in Michigan, but one had died in 2010. The other died in 2020 in May. But I did get to know her through email, Facebook, and so on. But Beth, it turns out, was living here in Texas.
Ah,
She's an hour and a half from me. She lives in College Station. And we met. So, in September, I got my record the next September 30th. And we met for the first time in a town near here called Temple, just before Thanksgiving in 2017. And
Right after, yeah.
her son was coming here to get a job interview in a big hospital complex. He's a nurse, a pediatric nurse. So I thought, well, that's great. I'll get to meet my nephew. And I said, look, you and your husband come. I'll get a motel room for both of us. We'll stay the night. We'll meet up about lunchtime while Daniel, her son, is in his meetings, and then we'll head out for dinner. And then we'll just, we'll stay overnight and we'll head out in the morning. So we did that. And we were in the hotel waiting for Daniel because this was about 5 o'clock in the evening. And he had all day interviews. So it was a long haul for him. And I got a call from my daughter. She asked if she and her husband could join us.
Oh,
And I was so touched by that. And I said, of course you can, and I told her where we were. So they drove out, and then Daniel came in, he ran upstairs to the shower and changed real quick. And we all went out to dinner. We had a wonderful time. So that was the first time we met. And
it's so
we really hit it
connecting,
off.
isn't it? It's so connecting.
It was amazing. Yeah. I mean, we don't look anything alike, but our personalities are very much the same. Our sense of humor is spot on. I mean, I don't know how many mouthfuls of coffee I've spewed over my.
we gotta stop recording.
Wait.
We gotta stop.
I'm sorry. So
So
anyway, it's been good. And eventually through DNA testing, I had a match with a woman who turned out to be my our half brother's daughter. And she was still online when I messaged her. She was still, logged into Ancestry. And within a few minutes, we found each other. And she messaged me back. She said, you can't see it, but I'm bawling my eyes out right now.
Aww.
It was that quick. It was just instantaneous. And he lives in Rhode Island, so we haven't met, but we talk on the phone all the time. And
How was his, it's his story, but how was his life? Was it?
His life was, he didn't fit in his family very well.
Mhm.
They were a very academic family. I mean, they treated him well. It wasn't like he was misused or anything, but he wasn't an academic type. And his father had been taught engineering in a college. His adopted mother was a principal in 2 schools in Bay City. So when he got out of high school, he joined the Navy and he never went back. But
And was he excited to have the connection?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And
So all in all, this has been a really happy reunion.
Yeah, the reunions have been great. And there's more reunions because I found out later, remember that niece I said who put me in touch with Beth? She didn't know who her father was. Her mother, a half sister who had died years before, had told her that she was the result of a gang rape.
Oh, dear
So
Lord.
if that were true, I can't imagine telling that to your daughter.
No.
She believed that her whole life. And so Beth bought her a DNA test a couple of years ago for Christmas. And she asked me to do the research because she doesn't know how to do that as well. And in turn, I did find her father. And it was not like, her mother said. She was welcomed by her father with open arms. She uses his last name now. They lived in the same
That's
town.
pretty hurtful to be raised with, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike, it does sound to me like you have a whole you could be an adoptee search angel.
Well,
I think that's something you should look
final
into.
entry here before we end.
Right.
In doing that, I found out that my sister Beth was only a half aunt to this niece. She's my half niece, and it was very obvious. So now Beth was born 9 years after the last of her sisters. She had 2 sisters born 47, 48. She was born in 57. And I've seen that happen before. When there's a gap like that, it's a warning sign. And I called Beth and I told her this. And she said, it's not entirely a surprise. Her parents divorced when she was 6. the girls were, the other two were older. They were in their teens already. The judge allowed the girls, the older girls, to pick which parent they wanted to go with. They both picked their father, which says something
Mm.
about.
About the
does.
mother. Mhm.
And it turns out, so Beth was adopted, and I found her. I'm not adopted, but was a, an illicit child,
Mm.
like the rest of us. And I found her father. He was 92 years old, still living in Michigan. She went to see him a year later
Aw,
after the lockdowns and all that.
yeah.
Then he died several months after they met. But she
Oh.
took a beautiful photo, and they're just, the resemblance is just remarkable. Several months after he died, she got a phone call from a half sister of hers to tell her that their father had added her to his will.
Aw,
And it was a substantial size. She didn't tell me, and I didn't ask, but I know that it was very,
He
came at a very
cared.
good time for them.
Yes.
And I thought, it doesn't get any sweeter than that. And she's
No, it
mentioned in the obituary. And
That's healing.
so right now, the only children of Carrie's that are alive are her 3 illicit kids, all of their fathers, all the black sheep of the family. The other 2 are now gone. And all of us were born on Wednesday. So I don't know if you knew that
Interesting.
child's
Wednesday
Yeah.
kids.
Monday's child is full of grace. Tuesday's child is something or other. But
Yeah.
Wednesday's child is full of woe.
Ah,
So when I
Wednesday's
saw
Oh,
that,
I'm gonna look up and see what day of the week I was born. I'd
All
say
different.
Wednesday.
I
would
was
be-
Friday the 13th, so I'm a little afraid.
Friday
of-
13th.
like
Yeah,
to
that
Another
was
way
me.
of saying whoa.
Friday the 13th was a wow.
Well, Mike, this has really been interesting and such a fascinating
Well,
conversation. And
Every
I
episode I've heard, when I found you guys, it was very early, I think. I don't remember exactly, but it's been great. And I
Thank
see
you.
great success. And
You've been a great friend to us and on social media and also just as a Patreon. And we are going to
Okay.
take your vote for the book that
Yes,
you're
I
putting
will
forward.
make sure
I will
you
send
send us
those
the
links. I will do that.
send us the links and
Much success. I hope it continues. I'm doing the
Thank
best
you.
I can to spread the word.
thank you. We really appreciate that.
You're doing a great job, and your stories
Aw.
are wonderful. Even though, it's amazing the juxtaposition, and you're still so close together, because
Yeah.
yours was obviously a different route than Louise's, and we're all
in it
here, we're
together,
survivors.
Sarah and
We
I.
all seem
Yeah.
to be doing okay, so
Yes,
better to be here than not. So
absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
all right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank
We'll
you,
talk to
Mike.
you soon.
Weekend. God bless.
Thank you.
You too.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.